Hey, everyone. Welcome back to another long, slow wander through history. If you're settling into bed, now's the time to dim the lights, pull up a blanket, and maybe light a candle that smells like something other than medieval Europe. Because tonight, we're drifting back to a time when cleanliness was less of a personal choice and more of a vague suggestion. A time when the streets weren't paved with gold, but with things far more organic. When perfume was not an accessory, but an act of survival, and when the greatest luxury in life might just have been a warm bucket of water that someone else didn't use first. This is the filthy truth about medieval bathing. How people actually stayed clean, or didn't. Let's start with the obvious myth. You've probably heard that people in the Middle Ages never bathed. That everyone walked around covered in a sort of historical glaze of dirt, sweat, and despair. That kings and queens went their entire lives without touching water, and that peasants lived in a haze of mud and manure until mercifully dropping dead at 35. That's not quite true. Or at least, it's only mostly true. The real story is a little weirder, and honestly, a little sadder, because medieval people did care about being clean. Tehus didn't he always agree on what clean meant. Let us float first to the early Middle Ages, that murky period after Rome fell, and before anyone could read again. The Romans, as we know, had public baths. Gigantic marble halls where half the city gathered to sweat, soak, and gossip about whose son was sleeping with whose senator. Cleanliness was practically a civic religion. The average Roman spent more time at the baths than most modern people spend on social media. But when the empire collapsed, so did the plumbing. The aqueducts stopped flowing. The bathhouses grew cold, and all that marble grandeur slowly filled with weeds, goats, and regret. Still, the idea of bathing didn't disappear entirely. It just relocated. By the 9th century, across parts of Europe, especially the more organized ones, like Byzantium, the concept of public bathing lingered. In Constantinople, the old Roman steam baths remained open. Monks occasionally wrote about them, often with suspicion. The problem wasn't the bathing itself, it was what people did while bathing. Apparently, communal steam rooms had a way of encouraging moral looseness, as the clergy politely called it, which is medieval for, "We found you doing unspeakable things in the hot tub." So, yes, the church wasn't entirely opposed to bathing, they were just opposed to enjoying it. As Christianity spread deeper into Europe, a new philosophy of hygiene took hold. Cleanliness was no longer about hygiene. It was about the soul. Washing too often was considered vain. Smelling too pleasant was considered suspicious. And bathing for pleasure, that was basically foreplay with the devil. Instead, spiritual cleanliness became the focus. Monks would wash their hands and faces before prayer, but a full bath was reserved for very special occasions, like when someone died. One monastic rule from the 10th century gently suggested that monks might bathe twice a year, once before Easter and once before Christmas, which, if you think about it, is technically biannual freshness. To be fair, bathing was hard work. Water had to be drawn, heated, and carried, often by someone with less enthusiasm for your hygiene than you had. There was no plumbing, no privacy, and certainly no bubble bath. So most people settled for what was known as a dry wash. This involved changing your linen underclothes, which, in theory, absorbed sweat and dirt, and shaking out your outer garments. A clean shirt meant a clean soul, or at least a slightly less itchy one. But let's drift north for a moment to Scandinavia. The Vikings, it turns out, were cleaner than most of medieval Europe, and they knew it. Arab chroniclers who encountered Norse traders were both fascinated and slightly alarmed by their hygiene habits. One 10th century account by an Arab traveler named Ibn Fadlan described how Vikings washed their faces and combed their hair every day, a shocking level of self-care by European standards. They even had designated wash basins. Granted, they all used the same one and didn't change the water, so the effect was mostly symbolic. Still, it's the thought that counts. The Vikings also used primitive soap made from animal fat and ash, which they rubbed into their hair to make it blonde. So yes, those iconic golden locks weren't always natural. It was, effectively, lye-based. Bleached, they were the world's first peroxide influencers, and because of this, Vikings gained a reputation among other Europeans as strangely appealing. English women reportedly found them irresistible, which didn't help diplomatic relations at all. Back in mainland Europe, things were less glamorous. Public bathhouses slowly made a comeback around the 12th century, particularly in places like France and Germany. At first, they were simple wooden structures, little more than huts with a hot cauldron of water in a communal tub. But by the 14th century, they had become full-fledged establishments, complete with steam rooms, attendants, and snacks. They weren't just for washing. They were for socializing, relaxing, and, frequently, sinning. Many bathhouses were unisex, which the church found unsettling. And when the plague hit in the mid-14th century, the entire practice took on a darker reputation. People began to believe that hot water opened the pores, allowing disease to seep in. It's a strange logic, but then again, medieval medicine wasn't exactly in its golden age. As a result, by the late 1300s, bathhouses were closing across Europe. The water grew cold again, and the continent returned to its natural state of mild filth. But that doesn't mean people stopped caring about smell. Far from it. Instead of water, they turned to scent. Perfumed gloves, herbal sachets, and scented oils became the hygiene of choice, especially among the upper classes. Queen Elizabeth I, centuries later, was famous for her fondness for perfume and clean linen. She reportedly bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not, which, by medieval standards, made her practically radiant. The wealthy often carried pomanders, little metal orbs filled with spices, ambergris, or crushed flowers. They'd hold them to their noses while walking through unpleasant streets, which was always, if you cold and tea, actually be clean. At least you could smell like something other than humanity. Let's drift for a moment into a medieval home. It's late evening. A fire is crackling, though the smoke fills more of the room than the chimney. A basin of water sits by the hearth. Someone's washing their face, slowly, with a rag that's seen better centuries. The air smells faintly of tallow, wood smoke, and onions. A child sneezes. Someone mutters a prayer. Outside, the street runs thick with whatever the neighbors emptied from their windows that morning. It's not quite squalor. It's just life. People weren't dirty because they liked it. They were dirty because clean water was hard to get and harder to keep. Every drop was carried by hand. Every bath was a small act of labor. And yet they tried. They brushed their teeth with charcoal. They used herbs like rosemary and mint to freshen breath. They rubbed rose water into their skin and combed their hair daily. Not perfect, but human. And that, perhaps, is the most honest image of medieval hygiene. Not filth, not glamour, but effort. Now, let's float a little higher to the upper tiers of society. The castles, the courts, and the royal chambers where the illusion of cleanliness mattered most. Castles, contrary to their majestic stone exteriors, were surprisingly smelly places. There was no plumbing. Waste disposal consisted of garderobes, essentially vertical holes that led down to a pit, or, if you were lucky, a moat. Some castles even had rooms where the walls were hollowed to catch heat from fireplaces. These doubled as convenient airing cupboards for clothes and linens. Bathing was done in large wooden tubs lined with linen sheets. Servants would bring heated water in buckets, pour it carefully, and sometimes even add herbs or milk. Kings and queens often bathed, surrounded by attendants, musicians, and courtiers, because nothing says privacy like 10 people watching you soak. Charlemagne, the great emperor himself, was known to enjoy bathing with his friends and guards. It was less of a hygienic ritual and more of a spa day with the boys. Centuries later, Louis XIV took hygiene in a different direction, which is to say, none. He famously hated bathing. Instead, he changed clothes constantly and drowned himself in perfume. At the height of his reign, the court at Versailles reportedly smelled like a mixture of roses, wine, and whatever the horses left behind. The palace had over 700 rooms and almost no toilets. Servants used corners, stairwells, and fireplaces as makeshift latrines. Visitors often complained of the smell, which was described as persistent. And yet, everyone pretended it was fine, because it was France, and elegance was a state of mind. We can't talk about medieval bathing without mentioning the rise of soap. It seems simple, but soap was a luxury for much of the Middle Ages. The earliest medieval soaps were harsh, made from animal fat and lye. They stripped dirt, and occasionally skinned. But by the 12th century, the soap makers of Marseille and Aleppo were producing finer versions using olive oil and soda ash. Aleppo soap, in particular, was prized for its softness and scent. It was one of the few Middle Eastern luxuries to reach Europe, even during times of religious tension. Crusaders brought it home, along with less useful souvenirs, like trauma. Over time, soap making became a craft, guarded by guilds. Each city had its own recipes and secrets. London soap was thick and plain. Italian soap was fragrant. French soap was pretentious and expensive, but still, most people didn't use it daily. Soap was for laundry, for the occasional bath, or for treating particularly dire medical situations. For everything else, there was linen, perfume, and the occasional blessing. It's easy, now, to imagine the past as endlessly filthy. But maybe that says more about us than about them. We live in a world obsessed with sterility. We sanitize, exfoliate, deodorize. We spray, scrub, and polish our bodies into something barely human. The medieval world didn't have that luxury, but it also didn't have our neural. They lived in the same smells, the same air, the same earth, and perhaps, in some odd way, that made them feel more connected to the world and to each other. Still, it must have been ripe. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've just survived 1,000 years of questionable hygiene. And as you drift toward sleep, remember the people of the Middle Ages weren't dirty because they didn't care. They were dirty because the world was because life was short, water was cold, and nobody had invented indoor plumbing yet. So, tonight, as you lie in your freshly washed sheets, maybe take a moment to appreciate soap, running water, toothpaste, and the quiet comfort of not living in a century where your neighbor might dump a chamber pot on your head. Good night, friends. Sleep well. And may your pores remain historically sealed. Hey again. If you're still awake after the first part, congratulations! You've successfully endured several centuries of historical body odor. So let's stay relaxed, stay horizontal, and float forward into something a little steamy. Literally. Because tonight, we're stepping into the medieval bathhouse, one of the strangest, most beloved, and eventually, most condemned institutions of the Middle Ages. Let's set the scene. It's the late 12th century. Cities are growing, and people are starting to have leisure time. Enter the bathhouse. At first, they were small, simple affairs. But by the 14th century, in cities like Paris and Prague, they'd become veritable social hubs, part spa, part tavernar, let's just say, evening entertainment venue. Rich and poor could visit, shedding their wool layers to sink into warm, fragrant water. Sometimes men and women bathed separately. Sometimes not. It was civilization's first wet restaurant, where you could sip wine while gnawing a chicken leg, all while sitting naked in a tub. Meanwhile, back in Western Europe, cleanliness was reinvented through linen. The logic went like this. If you wear fresh linen, it absorbs dirt and sweat from your body. When you change it, the filth goes with it, so you could, theoretically, remain perfectly clean without ever touching water. It was pseudoscientific nonsense, of course, but it was convenient. Rich nobles began to boast about their purity through fabrics, not soap. The whiter your shirt, the cleaner your soul. A 16th century French nobleman might own dozens of linen undershirts and change them several times a day, not because he was bathing, but because he wasn't. The smell, naturally, remained, but everyone else smelled too, so it all balanced out. Let's wander through a few specific examples of medieval clean freaks, Take Henry IV of France. He's often remembered as charming, brave, and catastrophically unwashed. His contemporaries noted that he stank like a wild goat, which, in fairness, might have been part of his charisma. He bathed rarely and once claimed that water makes one ill. Then there was Philip II of Spain. He was methodical, deeply religious, and fond of ritual. He believed washing the entire body was dangerous, so instead, he bathed only his arms and face carefully, and dried them with holy linen. The result was a ruler who was, quite literally, sanctified in grime. Of course, there were exceptions. Queen Isabella of Castile reportedly bathed only twice in her life, once on her wedding day and once after giving birth. But in fairness, she also conquered half of Spain, so perhaps she had other priorities. Catherine de' Medici, by contrast, was more enthusiastic. She imported Italian perfumes, built scented fountains, and encouraged bathing as a sign of refinement. At her court, smelling good became an art form, one that could bankrupt you, but ensured people wouldn't faint when you entered a room. Let's step away from the nobility for a moment, though. What about the peasants? What did ordinary medieval villagers do to stay clean? Danzueras, whatever they could. In most rural communities, bathing was seasonal. People washed in rivers or ponds during the summer and resigned themselves to filth during the winter. They might rinse their hands and faces daily and their feet weekly. A sensible compromise in a world of muddy fields and wooden shoes. Soap was homemade, rough, and precious. You'd use it sparingly, and mostly for laundry. But there were moments of real care. Medieval people, even the poorest, often took pride in combing their hair, cleaning their nails, and keeping their clothes tidy. They weren't oblivious. They just had fewer tools. It's tempting to imagine medieval Europe as one long, unwashed tragedy. But the truth is, people still loved the idea of water. They just had complicated feelings about touching it. Rivers were both sacred and dangerous. Wells were both blessings and potential disease traps. And the sea was a place for trade or exile. Cleanliness, for much of the Middle Ages, was a negotiation between faith, fear, and availability. When the Renaissance finally arrived, bringing with it plumbing, science, and slightly less superstition, people were still hesitant. It took centuries before daily bathing became normal again. So, where does that leave us? Well, somewhere between the bathhouse and the perfume bottle. The medieval world was full of contradictions. People built bathhouses, then condemned them. They celebrated purity, then avoided water. They invented soap, then insisted it was dangerous. And yet, in their own way, they were doing their best to make sense of a messy, unpredictable world. A world where life was short, and survival took precedence over comfort. Maybe that's why their obsession with scent, cloth, and ritual feels oddly human. Even now, we disguise the same anxieties, just with better plumbing. If your eyelids are heavy now, that's fine. You can drift off, knowing that somewhere in the distant past, a medieval innkeeper is still heating a pot of water over a fire, trying not to spill it on the floor. A monk is washing his hands for the 3rd time this year. A Viking is bleaching his beard and lye, and a French nobleman is spritzing himself with rose water, declaring himself the cleanest man alive. The world smells faintly of wood smoke, sweat, and lavender, and in its own strange way. It's beautiful. Good night, traveler. Sleep well, and may your dreams be scented, not steamy. Hey, again, if the first 2 parts were the Middle Ages at their ripest, this one is the slow rinse that followed. The centuries when Europe tried Berry Politelli to smell a little better. We're sliding now from the late 15th century into the early modern world. Renaissance scholars are rediscovering everything the Romans already knew and pretending they invented it. People are learning to read again. They're drawing perfect circles and building cathedrals that look like lace carved from stone. And somewhere among all that brilliance, a few brave souls are rediscovering soap. The earliest modern soaps were a curious mix of chemistry and vanity. In southern Euromarsa Savona, Naples soap makers were forming guilds. Each had its recipe, guarded more jealously than a royal marriage contract. The base was still olive oil and lye, But now perfumers were slipping in herbs and flower essences. Lavender for calm, rosemary for luck, and sometimes a little civet because nothing says refined. Light musk scraped from a cat's glands. Northern Europe, meanwhile, was slower to warm to the idea. The English and Germans still considered soap vaguely suspicious. In 1562, Queen Elizabeth I had to import her bars from Castile. They came wrapped in fine cloth and smelled faintly of lemons and Spanish pride. She adored them. Se justitenti used them very often. Let's drift into a London street around 1600. It's early morning. The air hums with wood smoke and damp. Down a narrow alley, behind a crooked door, a soap boiler is already at work. He's stirring a cauldron taller than himself, the steam thick, with a smell somewhere between candle wax and chemistry experiment. Fat goes in first beef, tallow from the butcher's yard, then ashes soaked in water to make lye. If he's lucky, he won't burn his eyebrows off before noon. Soap boiling was hot, filthy, and occasionally explosive. Whole neighborhoods complained about the stench, but the products sold. Housewives bought it by the slab, cut it with knives, and stored it like treasure in dry cupboards. Cleanliness, at last, was starting to have an economy. The church, of course, had mixed feelings. It always did. Washing the body was fine, as long as it didn't distract from washing the soul. So priests sprinkled holy water on everything, from infants to livestock. And if you couldn't afford soap, a blessing was considered the next best thing. Some theologians even argued that frequent bathing risked moral decay. After all, the devil, being fallen, was famously clean before his rebellion. One Dominican friar warned that too much scrubbing made one slippery to temptation. Which is impressive logic, really. By the 17th century, the great cities were once again flirting with public baths. But now they called them bains medicio, medical baths. Because if you attached the word medicine, no one could accuse you of enjoying yourself. In Paris, apothecaries prescribed bathing in sulfur springs for gout, in milk for skin ailments, and in wine for almost anything else, though mostly because wine was easier to come by than clean water. At Versailles, courtiers were divided. Some swore by cold baths for vigor. Others feared that water weakened the body's natural heat. Louis XIV, who, you may recall, loathed bathing, had his physicians douse him occasionally in alcohol instead. It called it a dry baptism. It didn't help. The Sun King still smelled faintly of candle smoke and ambition. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman world, the Turkish hammam, tribe descendant of the Roman bath, and far more organized than anything in Europe. Travelers from the West described them with equal parts envy and condescension. Marble halls, mosaics, attendants who actually knew what they were doing. Steam so thick it muffled the world. To a weary European nose, it was paradise. A few tried to bring the idea home. In Venice and Budapest, bathhouses returned. Less sinful now, more architectural. But they never quite recovered their communal warmth. Europe had become shy. Everyone wanted to be clean, just not seen getting clean. And then came the 18th century. The Enlightenment, that great moment of reason and wigs. If you've ever wondered what powdered hair smells like, Tian Sueri's sweet flour and old furniture. People were coating themselves in starch and perfume, creating a delicate crust of civility. Perfume, not soap, ruled the day. Men carried handkerchiefs, soaked in ambergris. Women powdered themselves until they resembled polite ghosts. A Parisian might go years without a full bath, yet change clothes thrice daily. Bathing became something done for health, not hygiene. A medicinal plunge supervised by doctors in wigs large enough to frighten small children. But quietly, science was catching up. Chemists were discovering that air, water, and disease were connected, not through sin, but through microbes. Though they didn't call them that yet. In 1677, Antony van Leeuwenhoek peered through his tiny microscope and saw a whole universe of any. He didn't know what they were, but suddenly the phrase "don't drink from the river" made sense. It took another century for anyone to act on it. But eventually, plumbing, sewers, and the humble bar of soap would become the quiet heroes of civilization. Let's pause for a moment and visit one last royal bathroom. It's 1808. Napoleon Bonaparte, conqueror of half the known world, is sitting in a copper tub. He bathes compulsively, sometimes twice a day. He dictates letters, while Sokin drives his servants mad and orders gallons of cologne from Cologne. When told that too much bathing might weaken him, he replies, "Then I will be the cleanest corpse in Europe." A rare moment of honesty from a man otherwise allergic to humility. His empress, Josephine, prefers baths scented with violets and strawberries. Their apartment smells like dessert. Parisian perfumers adore them both. It's an irony. No, for centuries, Europe avoided bathing out of fear. Now one little Corsican can't stop doing it. Progress, in its own soggy way. By the middle of the 19th century, soap had finally become a household necessity rather than a curiosity. Factories in England, Leva Brothers, Pears, and others turned it into an industry. They wrapped it in paper, stamped it with logos, and sold it as morality in a bar. Cleanliness, once spiritual, was now patriotic. Advertisements promised that soap made you respectable, that filth led to poverty, and that shining white laundry was proof of divine favor. The Victorians had turned hygiene into virtue. They scrubbed, polished, and disinfected everything, including, occasionally, their consciences. It's strange, isn't it? 1,000 years earlier, monks washed twice a year for purity. Now people wash daily for decency. Somewhere in between, we learned that cleanliness could be a kind of control, a way to order the world when everything else was uncertain. And yet, even with all our plumbing and scented soaps, the ghosts of the Middle Ages linger. We still attach morality to smell. We still judge the unwashed. We still use fragrance to declare who we are. Only now, instead of rosewater pomanders, we have aerosol deodorant. Different bottle, same insecurity. So, as you settle deeper into your pillow, remember, every drop of warm water that touches your skin is part of a very long story. From Roman baths to Viking bleach, from medieval perfume to industrial lather, it's a story of fear, faith, vanity, and small mercies. And it ends, tonight at least, with you clean, comfortable, and hopefully, almost, asleep. Because after 3 parts, and about a millennium of questionable hygiene, you've earned it. Good night, traveler. May your dreams be gentle, your sheets crisp, and your next bath pleasantly uneventful. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting even deeper into the soapy, not-so-soapy world of medieval cleanliness. We've wandered through the steam and stench of medieval Europe already, through monastic bath rules, peasant puddles, perfumed gloves, and aristocratic excuses for hygiene. But tonight, we're going to watch the idea of clean itself slowly evolve. This is a story about water, not the grand, roaring, heroic kind that floods kingdoms or carries fleets into battle. No. This is about the quiet, domestic trickle of water, the kind that flows from a spring or drips from a leaky cistern and changes how people live, without anyone noticing until centuries later. So, settle in. Dim your lights. Let your mind sink back through time to the moment when humans began to realize that water could do more than just quench thirst. It could wash away sin, stink, and, eventually, entire empires of grime. Let's start somewhere familiar. Ancient Rome. Because if we're talking about the journey from bathhouse to bathroom, we might as well begin with the civilization that turned washing into a sport, a ritual, and a status symbol all at once. The Romans loved their baths. Everyone knows that. What's less known is that, for them, the bathhouse was less about hygiene and more about networking. You didn't go to the thermae to get clean. You went to be seen to gossip, to flirt, to negotiate, to occasionally collapse from heat stroke in front of an audience. Cleanliness was just a polite side effect. Still, The Romans managed to build one of the most impressive public sanitation systems in history. Their aqueducts were architectural miracles, delivering water across vast distances with astonishing precision. And their sewers, the famous Cloaca Maxima, were engineering marvels that quietly carried away the evidence of Roman indulgence. When Roma fell, that infrastructure fell with it. The aqueducts cracked. The sewers filled. The pipes corroded and clogged. And soon, the world that once soaked in marble baths was reduced to washing its hands in wooden bowls. If it remembered to wash at all, by the early Middle Ages, bathing had become suspicious. Water, people thought, could open the pores, and open pores meant the devil or disease could slip right in, which was, admittedly, not entirely wrong. In a world where water was rarely clean, taking a full bath could, in fact, make you sicker. And so, for a few dark centuries, Europe retreated from the bath, but not completely. The story is never that simple. You see, even when Europeans stopped bathing in the Roman way, they didn't abandon the idea of being clean. They just redefined it. The monks led the way, as they often did. In monasteries, washing was tied to spiritual discipline. You were expected to wash your hands before meals, your feet before prayer, and your soul before death. Bathing the body might not have been frequent, but it wasn't forgotten either, especially for the sick or the poor. Many monasteries even had their own lavatorium, a kind of communal washing trough. For the more prosperous abbeys' bathhouses, not for pleasure, of course. Pleasure was a sin. These were for health, humility, and the occasional act of pious grooming. Still, it's fair to say that the everyday European's relationship with water had become complicated. The upper classes leaned on perfumes, powders, and fabrics to maintain appearances. They layered clean linen under dirty clothes, believing that cleanliness of fabric somehow transferred to cleanliness of flesh. The peasants, meanwhile, had more direct methods. Streams, ponds, and rivers remained the great communal bath and laundry. If the water didn't sparkle, well, neither did life. Now, if you drift eastward, things were different. In the Islamic world, bathing never lost its spiritual and practical importance. Cleanliness was, and remains, a cornerstone of daily life in Islamic culture, both for health and religious purity. The hammam, or public bathhouse, became an essential part of community life, much as the thermae had been for the Romans. Marble basins, warm tiles, flowing water. The experience was ritualized but deeply human. You didn't just wash your body, you reset your mind. When crusaders returned from their adventures or disasters in the Holy Land, they brought back more than relics and trauma. They brought back envy. They had seen what real cleanliness looked like. Warm baths, perfumed oils, clean fabrics. Some even tried to import the habits, though with limited enthusiasm. Medieval Europe had a curious talent for admiring something deeply while also declaring it sinful. By the 13th century, public bathhouses began reappearing in Europe. At first, they were modest, small wooden huts with tubs or steam rooms, often run by local entrepreneurs or attached to inns. In places like Paris, London, and Nuremberg, they multiplied quickly. People rediscovered the joy of soaking in hot water, of feeling warm and refreshed. Couples went together. Groups went together. Sometimes a little too together. Because where there is warm water, dim lighting, and minimal clothing, there is always scandal. Soon, bathhouses became known less for hygiene and more for extracurricular activities. Moralists warned of sin. Clergy preached of temptation. Authorities, reluctantly, tried to separate the baths from the brothels with mixed success. Still, for a brief, steamy moment in late medieval Europe, bathing was back. Then came the Black Death, and with it, paranoia. When plague swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, many blamed. What else?
Water.
Doctors argued that hot baths opened the pores and let the disease creep in. Cold baths, meanwhile, were said to shock the body into imbalance. In short, water was dangerous again. Bathhouses closed, steam rooms went silent, and the scent of rose oil, once a symbol of luxury, became a mask for death. For centuries after, Europeans would distrust bathing, especially the upper classes. They preferred to dry wash with cloths, sprinkle themselves with vinegar, and drown in perfume. The peasantry, lacking such luxuries, kept splashing around in rivers and buckets. They weren't necessarily cleaner, but they were, ironically, less afraid of water. Let's drift now into the Renaissance. Art, science, and culture were reborn. But bathing, still, not so much. Even the wealthiest nobles often avoided immersing their bodies fully in water. Queen Elizabeth I reportedly bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not, as one courtier noted. Of course, this was an exaggeration, but not by much. The wealthy relied on dry baths, wiping the skin with linen and rubbing scented oils to remove surface dirt. Clothing, especially the layers nearest the skin, was changed often. White linen was prized because it showed cleanliness. The body itself remained largely unwashed. Even doctors, for the most part, agreed. They warned that bathing could weaken the body by diluting the vital humors. In short, it was unscientific to enjoy yourself in a hot bath. And yet, quietly, the world was changing again. Asitius greu. So did their field. Streets overflowed with waste. Wells became contaminated. Epidemics spread faster. Public health, a concept barely recognized in the Middle Ages, began to take root. In the 17th and 18th centuries, small but significant shifts occurred. Water supply systems improved. Wells were deepened. Pumps appeared. And most importantly, scientists began to suspect that disease might have something to do with, well, dirt. The idea of miasma, bad air, took hold. People believed foul smells spread illness, so they began cleaning not for hygiene as we understand it, but to rid their homes of bad air. Ironically, this obsession with smell led to genuine cleanliness. Rooms were aired, linens wassaid, streets paved, and slowly, painfully, bathing returned. This time, in private, the public bathhouse faded. The private bathtub emerged, and the modern bathroom was born, not from luxury, but from fear of death. Let's pause here. Imagine yourself in a house in 1750. There's no plumbing, no running water. If you want a bath, someone has to heat a cauldron over a fire and pour bucket after bucket into a wooden tub. Bedtime. Ready, the water is lukewarm. The servant is exhausted. And you're already questioning your life choices. So people didn't bathe often, but they did begin to wash more hands, face, feet. Small acts of personal hygiene became marks of refinement. Soap, too, became more available. Once a luxury item made from animal fat and ash, it began to be produced in greater quantities. The great soap-making centers, Marseille, Castile, Naples, exported their fragrant bricks across Europe. The middle class, newly emerging and desperate to appear respectable, embraced the idea of smelling pleasant and looking polished. Cleanliness was no longer just about health or religion. It was about class. By the early 19th century, the Industrial Revolution began to reshape everything, including the bathroom. Cities grew rapidly. Populations exploded, and with that came cholera, typhoid, and a general sense of dread about what was lurking in the water. Once again, it was fear that pushed progress. Governments began to invest in sewers and waterworks, massive engineering projects that rivaled Rome's aqueducts. London's sewer system, designed by Joseph Bazalgette in the mid-1800s, became the model for modern sanitation. It didn't just carry waste away. It symbolized a new, hygienic ideal. Clean water became a public right. Dirty water, a public danger. The Victorians, ever dramatic, turned cleanliness into morality. Cleanliness is next to godliness, they said, forgetting, perhaps, that for centuries they'd considered bathing a gateway to sin. The bathroom, as we know it, emerged from this strange intersection of fear, morality, and engineering. At first, it was a luxury. An indoor room with plumbing was as much a status symbol as a carriage or chandelier. But as technology spread, so did the expectation of personal hygiene. Soap advertising exploded. Water companies promised purity. Doctors preached the gospel of bathing. And so, by the end of the 19th century, Europeans had come full circle. They had rediscovered what the Romans already knew: that water, when properly managed, the civilization's best friend. It only took about 1,000 years of filth to remember it. And yet, people remained people. Even as plumbing spread and hygiene became universal, the attitude toward cleanliness never quite lost its quirks. In the early 1900s, etiquette books were full of advice on bathing: how often to wash, how to dry properly, how not to splash excessively, lest it appear vulgar. There was, as always, a class dimension to it all. Too clean, and you might seem nouveau rich, showy, insecure. Trying too hard, too dirty, and you were clearly poor or foreign. The trick was to look effortlessly clean, as though hygiene simply radiated from your moral character. It was, in its own way, a return to medieval logic. Only this time, instead of sin, the enemy was sweat. Let us drift back to the forgotten corners of this story. The people who made all this possible. The soap boilers, the plumbers, the bathhouse attendants. In every age, these were the workers who lived closest to the idea of cleanliness, and often the furthest from its benefits. Soap making was dangerous. The fumes from boiling lye could burn the lungs. One careless spill, and the skin would blister. It was smelly, too, especially when using animal fat. The irony of toiling in filth to create cleanliness was not lost on anyone. Plumbers, likewise, lived in constant contact with water and waste. In many cases, their own homes had no plumbing at all. They built comfort for others while remaining surrounded by dampness and disease. It is a fitting metaphor for how progress often works. The clean hands at the top are washed by the dirty ones below. By the mid-20th century, the bathroom was no longer a luxury. It was a human right, or at least a modern expectation. Advertising shifted again. Soap was no longer about virtue. It was about freshness. Youth, romance, cleanliness had become sexy. Hollywood helped. The image of a woman stepping from a scented bath, or a man lathering his face in a gleaming white sink. These were the new icons of sophistication. Clean skin sold everything from razors to cigarettes. The bathroom became a stage for modern identity. And beneath it all flowed the same ancient water, the same quiet element that once trickled through Roman aqueducts and medieval wells. When we look back, it's almost funny. For thousands of years, human beings debated whether bathing was healthy, sinful, or simply a waste of time. They argued about whether clean meant holy, or whether it was just pretentious. But in the end, the water won. It seeped into our walls, our pipes, our daily rituals. It turned into a habit so natural that we forget it as a luxury, one that half the world still struggles to afford. We no longer think of bathing as spiritual, or political, or even historical. But every time you turn a tap, you're touching the final chapter of that long, messy, beautiful story. The quiet revolution that began in the ruins of Rome passed through plague and perfume and ended in porcelain and chrome. And so, as you drift tonight, maybe listening to the faint hum of your own plumbing somewhere nearby, remember that civilization was not built by kings or armies alone. Sometimes it was built by engineers, by soap makers, by monks, with book, by the anonymous hands that carried water, cleaned wounds, and kept the world from collapsing under its own dirt. Because history, like hygiene, only looks effortless when it's working. And on that note, let's close the tap for tonight. Sleep well, and may your dreams be clean. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're going somewhere very few history documentaries dare to linger. We're going behind the curtain, or more accurately, behind the curtain and slightly downhill, to explore what medieval people did with the less poetic byproducts of existence. Because for every golden chalice, there was a very full chamber pot. For every shining castle tower, there was a dark, dripping shaft underneath it. So get comfortable. Dim the lights, breathe slowly, and try not to think too hard about the smell. The story of medieval sanitation is, above all else, a story of creative denial. People knew what waste was. They just preferred not to discuss it, or to delegate the discussion to someone else. The word privy, after all, comes from private. It was literally the place you went to not be seen, not be heard, and, ideally, not be remembered. But archaeology has a way of remembering everything. What people threw away has become one of the richest sources of information about their lives. Their diets, their diseases, even their social ambitions. And so tonight, we'll wander through the medieval world's hidden infrastructure. Its cesspits, its guardrobes, its nightmen and gong farmers, and the noble art of pretending everything smelled fine. Let us start with the castles. Those glamorous fortresses that everyone imagines as glittering halls of chivalry. If you've ever toured one, you might have noticed a curious little protrusion sticking out of a tower wall. A narrow stone chute leading to open air. That, dear listener, was the garderobe. Essentially, it was a toilet built into the castle wall, with a hole leading straight down, often over a moat or a convenient patch of earth. The term comes from the French for wardrobe, because nobles often hung their clothes near it. The ammonia from the waste was believed to kill fleas. So yes, medieval wardrobes were sometimes literal. Guardrobes were marvels of minimalist engineering. Gravity did most of the work. There was no plumbing, no water, no seat-warming feature. Just stone, cold air, and a vague hope that whatever fell down the shaft would eventually go away. If you were lucky, the waste landed in a cesspit that could be cleaned out later. If you were unlucky, it didn't. Imagine being the servant assigned to that job. Now, the peasants didn't have they had fields, pits, or, if they were feeling refined, a communal latrine behind the village. And yet, their system was often simpler and safer. Waste was spread on fields as fertilizer, unpleasant, yes, but surprisingly efficient. It was the towns and cities that struggled. Medieval urban planning, successituas, did not prioritize sewage. Streets were narrow, surfaces uneven, and drainage, mostly theoretical. People used chamber pots, emptied them out windows, and trusted gravity and rain to handle the rest. In many cities, it was customary to shout a warning before dumping gardeslo. Watch out for the water. It rarely helped. Imagine walking through a 14th century London alley at night, the air heavy with smoke, ale, and something less identifiable. Every step, a gamble. Every open window, a potential hazard. They called it muck. You can call it whatever helps you sleep tonight. Speaking of sleep, every medieval home, even the humblest, had its night soil bucket. The bucket, of course, had to be emptied, and that's where the gong farmers came in. The name sounds whimsical, but their work was anything but. Gong farmers, or nightmen, were the unsung heroes of medieval sanitation. They cleaned out cesspits, privies, and latrine shafts, hauling away tons of human waste under cover of darkness. It was dangerous, nauseating work. Cesspits could collapse or produce toxic gases. Many nightmen suffocated in the very product of their labor. They were well paid by the standards of the time, but socially untouchable. The smell clung to their clothes, their homes, their lives, and yet, without them, the cities would have drowned in filth, which, at several points, they nearly did. Let's float gently toward one of those moments, the great stink of London, 1858. Technically, that's well after the medieval era, but it's the grand finale of the same long, fragrant tradition. By the mid-19th century, London's population had exploded, and its waste system had not. Everything, human, animal, industrial, went into the Thames, and the Thames, obligingly, gave it all back in the form of smell. That summer, the heat was unbearable. The river turned thick and brown, the stench so powerful it halted Parliament. Curtains were soaked in lime chloride to mask the odor. Some officials fled the city altogether. It took an engineer, Joseph Basalchete, to finally solve what centuries of moralizing and wishful thinking had not. His massive sewer system transformed London, and by extension, every modern city that copied it. So the Great Stink, while technically Victorian, was really the ghost of medieval waste, finally demanding to be dealt with. Back to the Middle Ages for a moment. Royal palaces had their own waste dilemmas. In Westminster Palace, cesspits were built directly under the floor's stone chambers that had to be emptied periodically by teams of unfortunate workers. One collapsed in 1183, reportedly with disastrous consequences for those above. In French palaces, garderobes often emptied into the moat, which means that the picturesque castle moat you've admired in paintings was, in many cases, a glorified open sewer. The frogs didn't seem to mind. Inside the royal chambers, chamber pots were everywhere, often made of pewter, sometimes silver, occasionally gold. Because of course, if you're going to be undignified, you might as well do it stop. Servants handled the emptying. They had euphemisms for it: slops, household refuse, domestic waters. Anything to avoid direct acknowledgement. It is strange to think that some of the most luxurious rooms in history were built directly above beneath the velvet, the marble, and the gilded ceilings. The quiet murmur of human reality. If you've ever wondered what medieval streets really smelled like, imagine a mixture of wood smoke, sweat, horse dung, rotting food, and an underlying sweetness of decay. People didn't mind as much as we would. Smell was part of life. Perfumes and herbs were everywhere, in homes, in churches, in clothing. Not to eliminate odor, but to compete with it. Monks burned incense to purify air. Housewives scattered rushes and herbs on floors, partly for decoration, partly to absorb spills. Apothecaries sold sachets of lavender and rosemary, promising to fend off disease and demons alike. The human nose adjusted, as it always does. Civilization carried on. Interestingly, not all medieval cities were equally foul. Some, like Lubeck and Bruges, had early waste management rules. Cesspits had to be lined with stone, kept a certain distance from wells, and emptied regularly. Violators could be fined. It wasn't modern sanitation, but it was something. In Islamic cities, such as Baghdad or Cordoba, drainage systems and public baths kept things cleaner still. Running water and organized waste disposal were part of civic pride, which makes European filth feel less inevitable and more like a cultural choice, a sort of stubborn resistance to plumbing. Let's drift back to the countryside again, where life was simpler, if not necessarily fresher. A peasant's privy was usually just a pit with a plank over it, discreetly tucked behind a hedge or barn. In winter, one might simply avoid the journey altogether and rely on a handy bucket. When the pit filled, it was covered over, left to compost, and a new one dug nearby. Primitive, yes, but surprisingly sustainable. Everything returned to the soil eventually, the medieval version of recycling, and then there was etiquette. Medieval courtesy manuals actually included advice on toilet behavior. Don't relieve yourself where others might see. Don't greet someone while you're doing it. Don't look into the cesspit. A surprisingly common warning. One 15th century writer even cautioned readers to avoid spitting or picking their teeth over the latrine. As such, behavior was uncleanly, which, considering the surroundings, seems almost sweetly optimistic. As we drift further into the late Middle Ages, the line between public and private sanitation begins to blur. Inns had shared privies. Markets had trenches or communal pits. In monasteries, long stone seats were built side by side, the monks sitting in silent, synchronized contemplation. There was no embarrassment. No partitions. No partitions. Just the steady trickle of water beneath, carrying everything away to a nearby ditch. Medieval life was communal in every sense. Privacy was a luxury of kings, and even they had to share their garderobes with draughts and pigeons. It's curious how something so universal remains so taboo. People wrote entire epics about war, love, and theology, but almost nothing about sanitation. The few references we have are either comedic or scolding. And yet, when archaeologists dig up, they find tiny windows into daily life. Cherry pits, fish bones, broken combs, lost rings, seeds from imported fruits. Even in filth, there's history. The detritus of the ordinary is what endures when palaces crumble. Pause. Voice softening. We spend so much time in history admiring what people built above ground, cathedrals, castles, walls, that we forget how much labor went into what lay beneath. Every civilization, before it rises, must decide what to do with its waste. Rome built sewers. Medieval Europe built moats. Both, in their way, worked for a while. But in the end, the lesson is simple. The story of progress is also the story of plumbing. Because until you control what leaves the house, you can't really claim to have mastered what's inside it. Excellent. Let's keep drifting. Nice and slow into the next segment of our late-night wander through medieval hygiene. We've covered where it all went, more or less. Now, let's explore why the toilet of all things became quietly tangled up with power, status, and the strange politics of who got to go in comfort. Continues. Part 5. The Secret Life of Medieval Toilets. The Royal Flush. How toilets became a symbol of power. Imagine, for a moment, that you are a medieval king. You wake up in a cold, drafty chamber lined with tapestries depicting heroic ancestors who never had to explain plumbing. You stretch, you yawn, and you realize nature has called. You could, of course, use the chamber pot by your bed, but that's what ordinary kings do. You're not ordinary. You're divine. So you summon your groom of the stool. Yes, that was a real title. A highly respected one. The groom of the stool was, in essence, the king's bathroom assistant, but he was much more than that. A trusted companion, keeper of secrets, and sometimes a political confidant. He handled the royal chamber pot, discreetly, reverently, and with the understanding that proximity to a monarch's most private moments meant proximity to his ear as well. By the Tudor era, this humble-sounding position was one of the most powerful posts in court. Henry VIII's grooms, men like Sir Henry Norris, were among his closest friends. They helped him dress, discuss state matters during private moments, and occasionally found themselves executed when those private moments led to gossip. It turns out, being too close to the king had occupational hazards. Still, the role's prestige says something remarkable. Even the act of relieving oneself could become political theater. To attend a monarch was an honor. To attend them there, in the privy chamber, meant true intimacy. Courtly life revolved around proximity. The closer you were to the king's body, the closer you were to his favor. And so, paradoxically, the royal toilet became an office of influence. Some historians have described it as the axis of intimacy. Others, less poetically, as the back end of government. Both are correct, but let us leave the palaces for a moment and float over to the monasteries again. Because monks, too, had their own brand of plumbing politics. In the great abbeys of England and France, latrines were built with surprising care. Long stone benches with evenly spaced holes, usually over a stream or channel of running water. Some even had rudimentary ventilation shafts. The Cistercians, ever the engineers, placed their latrines at the far end of dormitories, with a gravity-fed system to carry waste away. It wasn't luxury, but compared to the average peasant's pit, it was practically monks followed strict routines. Even in this, silence was mandatory. The rule of St. Benedict had little to say about toilet behavior, but it was understood efficiency, modesty, no conversation. It's hard to imagine a more contemplative experience, a row of hooded figures, seated in reverent quiet, each communing privately with both nature and plumbing. Meanwhile, out in cities like Paris or London, civic authorities were perpetually at war with their own rivers. By the 13th century, cesspits were overflowing. Regulations appeared, insisting that they be sealed, emptied, and kept away from wells. Naturally, no one obeyed. It's estimated that in medieval Paris, Tens of thousands of gallons of waste were dumped daily into the Seine. London's Fleet River fared no better, reduced to a sluggish brown channel by the 1400s. People complained, of course, but only when it started to smell. The chronicler's favorite phrase was corruption of the air. It sounded moral, but it was really all. When the scent became too much to bear, laws were written. They were rarely enforced. Let's return briefly to the castles again, because the evolution of the garderobe tells us so much about the medieval mind. Early ones simply dropped into open space, the medieval equivalent of out of sight, out of mind. But as castles grew more elaborate, garderobes multiplied. Each tower might have several, stacked vertically, a literal hierarchy of sanitation. Waste from the upper floors trickled down to meet that of the lower. The physics of privilege. Architects, of course, tried to hide it. Walls thickened, chutes angled away, but nothing entirely masked the scent. Even royal noses had limits, which might explain the medieval fascination with incense, perfumes, and pomanders, little orbs of scented herbs carried everywhere. They weren't just fashion. They were survival equipment. One of the stranger facts about the medieval toilet is how social it could be. Shared, latrines weren't just a peasant thing. Even noble estates sometimes had multi-seat arrangements, perhaps a gesture toward equality, or simply an economy of stonework. Privacy, as we think of it, didn't really exist. The human body was less mysterious. You did what needed doing, exchanged a few polite comments about the weather, and went about your day. It wasn't until the Renaissance that people began to find all this embarrassing. And even then, it took centuries for shame to overcome practicality. Then came the Renaissance engineers, obsessed with hydraulics, fountains, and the movement of water. Leonardo da Vinci naturally sketched elaborate systems for flushing latrines, though, as with many of his inventions, they were too expensive and too clever to be used. In 1596, Sir John Harrington Godson, to Queen Elizabeth I, installed what he proudly called a water closet. It had a flush valve, a cistern, and even a seating arrangement fit for a monarch. Elizabeth was impressed. She was less impressed when it leaked. The concept never caught on, not until the 18th century, when Thomas Crapper, yes, the name is real, though his fame is exaggerated, refined it for mass production. Still, the idea that comfort and cleanliness might go together had been planted. The toilet was no longer just an architectural necessity. It was becoming an emblem of civilization. But even centuries later, the association between class and cleanliness persisted. The rich had privy chambers. The poor had public pits. Royalty had grooms. Peasants had buckets. And yet, in their own way, everyone was participating in the same delicate balance. The eternal negotiation between dignity and biology. For all its silks and ceremonies, the medieval world was never far from the raw, earthy reality beneath it. That's what makes it strangely comforting. For all our advances, we haven't changed that much. Let's pause for a moment here. Imagine a medieval street again, moonlight glinting on cobblestones, a faint hum of tavern voices, a horse stamping somewhere nearby. Someone opens a shutter above, a quiet slosh, a muttered apology. And then silence. The world keeps turning. Life goes on, and the night air carries away another small, unspoken truth of human history. When we look back at the Middle Ages, we tend to see grandeur, cathedrals rising, knights shining, kings feasting. But beneath it all were privies, pits, and pipes. Quiet little rooms that tell us, perhaps better than any throne, how people really lived. Because if you want to understand a society, don't start with its palaces, start with its toilets. They never lie. Soft closing tone and that S. Where we'll leave it tonight. Somewhere between the garderobe and the great stink, suspended in that curious middle ground between civilization and compost. Thank you for drifting through another quiet corner of history with me. Sleep well and be grateful for modern plumbing. Every wine. Tonight, we're wandering back into the medieval world again. This time, not to look at what people built or believed, but what they smelled like. Or rather, what they tried to smell like, because in an age when bathing was rare and waste was public, The only real weapon against odor was perfume. Perfume, incense, herbs, and the comforting illusion that something fragrant could ward off death itself. So, get comfortable. Breathe through your nose while you still can, and let us drift through the scented haze of the Middle Ages. The medieval world was not, contrary to popular belief, completely filthy. It was simply organic. People, animals, cooking, candles, fires, everything produced a scent. And without modern plumbing, deodorant, or garbage collection, those scents didn't go away. They mingled, fermented, and deepened into what one chronicler politely called the perfume of humanity. It wasn't always unpleasant, just present. People got used to it. You can get used to almost anything. Still, they made an effort. Perfume was everywhere, not just for nobles, but for everyone who could afford a whiff of respectability. Let's start with the nobles, of course. Their lives were surrounded by scent, perfumed oils for hair, rose water for washing hands, scented gloves, and sachets of herbs sewn into clothing. At feasts, tables were strewn with lavender and time to mask the smell of the guests, and occasionally, the food. In royal courts, perfume wasn't just decoration. It was defense. People genuinely believed that bad smells, called miasmas, caused disease. The logic was simple. If the air smelled foul, it must be harmful. If it smelled sweet, it must be safe. And so, medieval people perfumed, not for beauty, but for survival. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century, the miasma theory reached its peak. Doctors wore those long, bird-like masks, stuffed with herbs and flowers meant to purify the air. The classic image looks sinister now, but it was actually meant to be comforting, a sort of mobile potpourri with a beak. Inside those masks were crushed roses, mint, cloves, myrrh, and occasionally camphor, anything strong enough to overpower the stench of sickness and decay. It didn't work, of course. The plague was carried by fleas and rats, not smell. But in a world that didn't understand germs, scent was science. If something smelled alive, it felt safe. Ordinary people fought the miasma in their own way. They burned juniper branches, fumigated homes with rosemary, or hung herbs around their necks. Some carried pomanders, little metal balls filled with scented herbs and resins. They jingled softly as people walked, releasing little puffs of comfort. Pomanders became fashionable, even chic. Nobles had them made of silver or gold, filled with ambergris or musk. Commoners made do with wax and herbs, but everyone high or low seemed to agree. The nose was a doorway, and it needed guarding. The church, naturally, took an interest. Incense had been used in religious rituals since ancient times, but in medieval Europe, it took on new significance. It wasn't just symbolic, it was sanitary. Churches were crowded, airless, and full of candles, sweat, and, occasionally, livestock. Incense made worship bearable. Priests swung censers of frankincense and myrrh, not only to honor God but to clear the atmosphere. One 13th century cleric even wrote that incense drives away the stench of sin and other inconveniences. A practical theology, if ever there was one. Meanwhile, perfumers were becoming artisans in their own right. In Paris, they were known as gantiers parfumers, glove makers who scented their wares to hide the smell of tanned leather. The trade grew luxurious. By the 15th century, perfumed gloves were a must-have accessory for the elite. The fashion spread to Italy and Spain, and from there to the rest of Europe. The ingredients were exotic. Musk from Asia, ambergris from Wales, civet from African cats, and attar of roses from the East. Each fragrance came with a story and a price. In a way, perfume became the medieval version of fine jewelry. Proof that you could afford to smell like something that wasn't to you. But perfume wasn't just about elegance. It was medicine. Medieval physicians prescribed scented remedies for nearly everything. Got a headache? Smell rose water. Melancholy. Inhale amber or clove. Fainting. Try vinegar of the Four Thieves. A pungent mix of garlic, rosemary, and wine vinegar. It probably didn't help, but at least it cleared the sinuses. During outbreaks, people held nosegays to their faces in public. Sweet posies. Take a dead. Dem little bouquets. Meant to ward off contagion. The phrase, ring around the rosy. Yes, the nursery rhyme is often said to refer to this practice, though that's probably apocryphal. Still, the imagery fits. Flowers, ashes, and the futile hope that something pleasant could keep the plague away. Let's drift back to the domestic side again. Inside a medieval home, maybe around 1350. The air is thick with wood smoke and cooking fat. The floor is strewn with rushes, sprinkled with dried herbs. People changed those rushes a few times a year. Sometimes, when the herbs began to rot, they simply added more, layers upon layers, like a compost heap of good intentions. And yet, visitors often describe medieval homes as sweet-smelling. Not because they were clean, but because everyone's sense of normal was different. A mix of rose petals, animal fat, candle smoke, and humanity was simply what life smelled like. For the wealthy, fragrance was also tied to morality. A clean-smelling body implied a clean soul. A foul odor suggested sin, or worse, poverty. Writers of the time loved to moralize about this. The poor, they said, stank of the earth. The rich, perfumed by civet and rose, were closer to heaven, which says less about hygiene than it does about class. But it also reveals something deeper. In a world obsessed with decay, to smell alive was to prove you hadn't yet succumbed. Perfume wasn't just pleasant, it was existential. And of curse. There were accidents. Some scents were overpowering, even toxic. Early perfumes were made with alcohol, resin, and animal products that aged badly. Stored too long, they turned rancid. Sprayed too generously, they caused fainting or nausea. Queen Elizabeth I, who adored perfumes, reportedly had her own custom blends. But her courtiers sometimes complained that the Queen's chamber reeked of civet. It seems even royalty could overdo it. By the late medieval period, the connection between scent and spirituality had become nearly inseparable. Heaven, in art and literature, always smelled of flowers. Hell, predictably, of sulfur. Saints were said to emit the odor of sanctity, a literal fragrance that appeared at their death, proving divine favor. Meanwhile, sinners and heretics were described as false-smelling, even in life. It was theology by nose. There's something almost tender about it, though. People in the Middle Ages lived surrounded by decay. Food spoiled quickly. Diseases struck without warning. Death was constant company, so they fought back the only way they could with scent. Every herb burned, every rose distilled, every pomander filled with spice was a tiny act of defiance. A way of saying, yes, the world stinks, but we can make a little part of it smell like paradise. And maybe that's why medieval perfume still fascinates us. It wasn't just vanity. It was survival, hope, and longing, bottled up in rosewater and ambergris. A way of carrying beauty into a world that was, quite often, anything but. Everyone. Tonight, we're not visiting the battlefield or the banquet hall. We're stepping inside the medieval bedroom that most private of spaces, which, ironically, was almost never private. So settle in. Fluff your pillows, and let us drift back to a world where a good night's sleep was mostly an aspiration, and romance was a contractual obligation involving dowries, witnesses, and the occasional goat. In theory, the medieval bedroom was a place of intimacy and rest. In practice, it was a crowded, drafty, multi-purpose chamber where people talked, dressed, prayed, birthed, and, yes, slept. A nobleman's bedchamber wasn't just for him and his spouse. It was a miniature stage of domestic politics filled with servants, attendants, and visiting cousins who never seemed to go home. Curtains surrounded the bed, not for romance, but to block cold air and curious eyes. They rustled like sails at night, trapping whatever warmth to humans could generate before the fire went out. If you imagine medieval nights as candlelit serenity. Don't. They were full of creaks, snores, scuttling mice, and whispered prayers to survive until morning. Let's talk about the bed itself, because it was practically a person. Beds were heirlooms, massive wooden frames stacked with straw, feathers, and whatever passed for comfort. The mattress had ropes or leather strips across the frame, which sagged over time, hence the phrase, sleep tight. It meant, quite literally, tighten the ropes before lying down. The wealthy layered blankets, quilts, and furs, until the bed resembled a soft fortress. The poor made do with sacks of straw or rushes spread on the floor. In winter, everyone huddled. In summer, they itched. Sleep itself was different too. People didn't sleep straight through the night. They had what's now called segmented sleep. You went to bed after sunset, slept a few hours, woke up in the middle of the night for prayers, conversation, or mild existential dread, and then fell asleep again until dawn. This first sleep and second sleep pattern was perfectly normal, a rhythm shaped by candlelight, cold, and human metabolism. If you woke up at 2 a.m. in the 14th century, you might stoke the fire, read a psalm, or simply think about life, sin, and tomorrow's bread ration. Some people used the interval for, shall we say, marital diplomacy. Others just stared into the darkness and listened to the wind whistle through the shutters. A quiet hour between sleeps, that was the medieval version of a bedtime scroll through your phone. And speaking of marriage, the medieval idea of romance was rarely romantic. Marriage was business, property, alliance, lineage. The church called it sacred. Families called it strategy. And the people actually getting married, well, they called it unavoidable. A young noblewoman might meet her husband on her wedding day. A merchant's son might be bartered for trade advantages. Consent was politely assumed. Love, when it appeared, was treated with suspicion. Troublesome, unpredictable, dangerously French. Courtly love poetry, the sighing troubadours and chivalric knights, was fantasy for bored aristocrats, not marriage manuals. Real marriage was paperwork followed by witnesses watching you go to bed. Yes, literally. Bedding ceremonies were a thing, a legal formality to ensure the marriage was consummated. The couple was escorted to bed amid cheering relatives, often with clergy present to bless the sheets. Sometimes, the onlookers stayed until the deed was clearly underway. Privacy was considered suspicious. Fertility was a public concern. It wasn't until later centuries that couples were allowed to retreat behind curtains with dignity intact. Until then, love began with applause. For ordinary people, things were simpler, if not exactly sweeter. Peasants often married late, in their mid-20s, once they could afford a household. A wedding feast might include bread, ale, and a communal bed. Houses had one room. Everyone slept together. Parents, children, sometimes livestock. It was warm, noisy, and smelled of humanity and hay. Sex was as practical as everything else. A means to more hands for the field. Passion, if it happened, was treated like a pleasant accident. Beds and taverns and inns offered their own adventures. Travelers shared them with strangers. Lisi included 2, 3, sometimes 4 people per bed, each armed with their own blanket and a healthy mistrust of the others. You were expected to sleep back to back, which, in medieval terms, counted as proper manners. Facing someone implied intent. The etiquette books even said so. Lie decently, with thy feet toward thy companion, and not thy face. Good advice then, and perhaps still. Now, the royal bedroom. That was another world entirely. A king's bed was not merely for sleeping. It was a symbol of monarchy itself. Royal births, audiences, and even council meetings happened there. Courtiers gathered while the king reclined half-dressed, half-awake, to discuss matters of state. It was called the levee, the rising ceremony. In France, Louis XIV turned it into theater. Hundreds attended his morning routine. The shaving, the robe, the gentle shuffle toward breakfast. Each gesture was power, performed from the royal bed like a stage. So yes, in the most literal sense, government often began under the covers S for queens. Their bedrooms were political. 2. A queen's main task, bluntly put, was to produce heirs, and the entire court paid attention to whether she did. Pregnancies were public events. Births happened in crowded rooms filled with attendants, noblewomen, and observers eager to confirm legitimacy. Privacy, again, was a modern invention. In medieval royalty, even childbirth came with an audience. Let's drift quietly to the subject of dreams, because medieval people took them seriously. Dreams were messages from God, from demons, from last night's stew. Monks kept dream journals. Scholars wrote treatises on interpretation. A dream of water might foretell cleansing. A dream of falling, sin. A dream of nakedness, well, that depended on who was watching. Sleep was porous, the boundary between body and spirit loosened. You might wake convinced you'd been visited by angels, or by something less holy. People prayed before sleep, not for rest, but for protection, from nightmares, from sudden death, from the devil's meddling. It's oddly comforting, isn't it? We still do the same thing. Check the locks, silence the phone, hope for quiet. As the night wore on, the fire dwindled, the room cooled, someone coughed. The dog shifted. Somewhere outside, a watchman called the hour, 3 o'clock, and all's well y traddle was. But the phrase helped. If you think medieval people were prudish, think again. They were simply public. Bodies were everywhere, naked in bathhouses, bundled in shared beds, displayed in childbirth, confessed in sickness. What we now call privacy would have seemed lonely. Yet, despite the crowds and the cold, there was tenderness. Letters between spouses show real affection. Jokes, worry, longing. Love found its way between duty and drafty sheets. Even the poorest homes had their little rituals, a shared blanket, a whispered prayer, a goodnight gesture that meant we survived another day. It's strange, really. For all the discomfort, people slept and dreamed and woke to do it all again. The medieval bedroom was never truly silent, never truly private, never truly clean, but it was human. And maybe that is what makes it easy to imagine lying there in the flicker of firelight, surrounded by breathing, snoring, ordinary life. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're talking about food, or, more precisely, the art of eating very little and pretending you enjoyed it. The medieval diet was built around one great, unshakable fact. Most people were hungry most of the time, not starving, necessarily. Though that happened often enough, but existing in that steady, knowing state between not enough and barely adequate. And yet, they managed. They made it ritual, even holy. Because when you live in a world where crops fail and meat spoils, every crumb feels meaningful. Let's begin with the basics. Bread and beer. If you picture a medieval meal, forget the turkey legs and roasted pigs you see in fantasy films. The real foundation of life was a loaf and a mug. Bread was everything. Plate, utensil, and sustenance. Beer was breakfast. You'd wake before dawn, say a prayer, and reach for a tankard of weak ale. Children drank it. Monks brewed it. Women managed the household barrels. It wasn't the heady, golden stuff of modern pubs. It was more like a liquid loaf, thick and nourishing, safer than water. Because, of course, the water was usually unsafe. Rivers were full of what you might politely call runoff, both human and otherwise. So people turned grain into drink and yeast into life insurance. Now, bread, the bread. For peasants, it was often dark and dense, made from rye, barley, or whatever grain survived the season. Sometimes they stretched it with peas or acorns. Wheat bread was the white gold of the upper classes. If your loaf was pale and soft, it said you were closer to God and further from manual labor. There was hierarchy, even in crumbs. The wealthy used trenchers, flat slices of stale bread, as edible plates. After the meal, these soaked hunks were given to servants, or the poor. So, yes, charity existed. It just came slightly pre-chewed. Meals weren't daily luxuries. They were clockwork tied to sunlight and season. Breakfast wasn't much of a thing. Perhaps a crust and some ale for workers heading out at dawn. The main meal came at midday, when everyone gathered to eat together. Dinner, if it happened, was before sunset. After dark, candles were too costly, and the smoke too stifling. This rhythm was almost religious light, and labor dictating the menu. Speaking of religion, it practically sat at the table. The medieval church regulated what you could eat and when. Fasting days filled the calendar, over 150 a year, when meat was banned. That left fish. Lots and lots of fish. Rivers, lakes, and ponds became spiritual assets. Monasteries built elaborate fish ponds, stocked with carp and eels. Eel, in particular, was the medieval chicken nugget, served fried, stewed, roasted, and occasionally disguised as something more exciting. During Lent, cooks got creative. They made imitation eggs from almond milk and colored dough. Fish was molded to look like birds. The pious could indulge, so long as they squinted. For peasants, fasting was less of a moral challenge and more of a permanent condition. Meat was rare, sol was precious. And vegetables. Well, they were there, though rarely celebrated. Cabbage, turnips, onions, leeks. These were the pillars of the common table, and from them came pottage, a thick, endless stew that simmered day after day, with ingredients constantly added and removed, a sort of living soup, mildly sentient by week's end. Now, the upper classes, they had it better, though not necessarily tastier. A noble's feast might feature venison, boar, or peacock, though the last was more for decoration than dining. They'd roast the bird, then reattach its feathers for display, a triumph of visual over edible art. Spices were the real prize. Imported from Asia and the Middle East, they announced wealth more loudly than any crown. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, worth their weight in gold. They didn't just flavor food. They displayed power. If your roast duck tasted faintly of cardamom, everyone knew you were rich enough to waste cardamom on duck, but luxury had its limits. Meat spoiled fast. Ice was non-existent. Preservation meant salt, vinegar, or hope. So aristocrats ate heavily seasoned dishes, not for exotic flair, but to disguise questionable freshness. Banquets lasted hours, sometimes days. The music never stopped. The wine never helped. By the end, half the guests were asleep, and the other half were debating theology between hiccups. Let's take a quiet detour to the monastery kitchens. Monks lived by a schedule tighter than any noble court. Meals were silent, taken in long halls, with only the sound of spoons and scripture being read aloud. Their diet was plain: bread, beans, cheese, fish, and ale. But the portions were generous. Fasting or not, monks rarely starved. Abbeys became culinary centers, experimenting with cheese, beer, and early liquors. The very first European distillers were monks seeking medicinal spirits. So if you've ever had a fine Belgian ale or a smooth brandy, you can thank someone who took vows of silence but not abstinence. Food was social glue, too. Feasts marked births, weddings, harvests, saints' days. The poor might not eat meat all year, then gorge for one sacred evening. Communal meals reinforced bonds and hierarchy. Where you sat said everything. The high table was for nobles, the side benches for servants. The dogs, naturally, sat anywhere they pleased. As for manners, well, they were evolving. Forks were rare. Most people ate with their hands, or with knives shared among guests. Cleanliness was encouraged, but optional. A good guest wiped their hands on the tablecloth, not their tunic. Belching was considered honest appreciation. Chewing quietly was for the deceitful. In that sense, the medieval feast was loud, fragrant, and oddly sincere. The poor had their own culinary artistry. They baked oat cakes on hot stones, They flavored thin gruels with herbs and onion. Every scrap of fat was saved, every crust reused. Even bones became soup, and soup became survival. In cities, street food thrived. Pies, pastries, pancakes. London alone had thousands of pie sellers. The pies were filled with whatever was available. Beef if you were lucky, pigeon if you weren't, and mystery if you didn't ask. Food preservation was a constant battle. Salted meats, smoked fish, dried fruits, all depended on the season. In winter, people prayed the stores would last. In summer, they prayed the flies would not. Vinegar and honey were prized as antibacterial miracles. People understood freshness not as chemistry, but as grace. If something looked edible and didn't fight back, it was dinner. Let's pause for a moment and picture a quiet farmhouse evening. The day's work is done. The pottage pot bubbles softly over the fire. A crust of bread rests by the hearth. Children sleep on straw near the warmth. The adults eat slowly, passing a wooden bowl back and forth. There's no hurry, just fatigue, gratitude, and the soft rhythm of survival. That was dinner for most of history. Simple, repetitive, and astonishingly human. The medieval diet may seem bleak, but it carried its own kind of balance. Grains, vegetables, and limited meat by modern standards. It wasn't terrible. What killed people wasn't the menu. It was the scarcity, the contamination, the sheer unpredictability of nature. When a harvest failed, famine followed. When famine struck, disease followed that. Food was never just food. It was fate. And yet, through it all, people sang about bread. They thanked God for fish. They toasted with beer that barely counted as alcohol. Because hunger didn't just shape their bodies, it shaped their prayers, their songs, their patience. The promise of heaven, after all, was described as a feast, a table that never ran out of wine, bread, or light. So if you're listening right now with a full stomach, count yourself among the lucky. You've already surpassed centuries of kings and peasants alike. And as you drift off tonight, maybe imagine that you're resitting by a medieval hearth. A bowl of soup in your hands, bread on your lap, fire flickering against the dark. It's quiet. The world outside is uncertain. But inside, for a few moments, you're fed. Everyone. Tonight, we're not talking about kings or castles. We're talking about survival. The quiet, stubborn, keen. Because life in the Middle Ages was, to put it mildly, fragile. People were born small, lived hard, and usually died of something preventable. But the miracle is, they kept going anyway. So, let's wander softly through the centuries of sickness, superstition, and soap, or lack thereof. A time when perfume was medicine, and a sneeze could end a kingdom. We might as well start with the word that makes everyone's shoulders tense. Plague. There were many, of course. The medieval period was basically a revolving door of epidemics. But the one that haunts the imagination, the one that turned Europe into a whispered prayer, was the Black Death. It arrived quietly in the late 1340s, carried by ships, rats, and fleas. And once it began, it didn't stop for years. People didn't know what it was. The pestilence, the great mortality, or more simply, God's anger. It spread faster than fear could keep up. Cities emptied, villages disappeared, and somewhere in the chaos, doctors started wearing bird masks. Now, about those masks, you've seen them long, beaked, theatrical things, stuffed with herbs and vinegar-soaked cloth. They looked like something out of a fever dream. And in a sense, the idea was that bad air miasma caused disease. So, if you filtered that air through pleasant smells, you'd be fine. It didn't work, of course, but it did make doctors the best-dressed figures. In an otherwise bleak apocalypse, perfume, incense, and spices were the medieval equivalent of hand sanitizer. If something stank, you assumed it was contagious. If something smelled sweet, it felt safe. Hence, the rise of pomanders. Little metal bowls filled with herbs and ambergris, hung around the neck like portable gardens. They were meant to ward off disease. At best, they just made death smell faintly of cinnamon. Perfume was more than vanity. It was defense. Roses, lavender, myrrh, and vinegar oil used to cleanse the air. People burned juniper in sick rooms and washed walls with wine. Churches filled with incense, not just for holiness, but for hygiene. And when plague came, the rich sealed themselves inside perfumed chambers. It helped psychologically, and occasionally it helped statistically, because avoiding contact with others, even for the wrong reasons, sometimes saved lives. The irony of the medieval world was that the cleaner you were, the more suspicious people found it. In the height of the plague, some believed bathing opened your pores, making you vulnerable to bad air. So people sealed themselves under layers of fabric, perfume, and denial. Decadit, closing the body. The result was a population that was both sick and astonishingly fragrant. Medicine, meanwhile, was a curious blend of astrology, theology, and guesswork. Physicians studied the balance of the four humus blood: phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were ill, it meant one humor had gotten uppity. The cure: restore balance. This might mean bloodletting, purging, or drinking concoctions that could kill you faster than the illness. Leeches were popular. So was mercury. Because if it burned or bled, it must be working. Doctors weren't useless, though. They just had the wrong tools. Many recommended clean air, moderate diet, and gentle exercise, which, in fairness, remained sound advice. They understood that filth bred disease. They just didn't know how. Some towns even instituted early forms of quarantine. Ships from infected ports were made to wait 40 days before unloading. Answer the word kuranding, from kuranta journey, 40 days. And yes, people complained about it even then. Some things never change. If you survive childhood, you're already a statistical miracle. Infant mortality was brutal. A third of children didn't make it past 5, and every mother knew grief as a neighbor. Illnesses we now shrugged off, measles, flu, dental abscesses, could easily end a life. There were no antibiotics, no anesthetics, and very few second chances. Even childbirth was a gamble. Women prayed to Saint Margaret, patron saint of safe delivery, often clutching her image during labor. The men waited outside, praying to whoever would listen. Yet, despite it all, there was humor. Human beings are remarkably good at laughing in the wrong places. Medieval songs and poems joked about sickness and sin, mixing the sacred and the profane in equal measure. There were plays called The Dance of Death. Cheerful little reminders that everyone, peasant and pope alike, had a partner waiting in the grave. It sounds morbid now, but to them, it was oddly comforting. If everyone dies, no one dies alone. Cities learned to cope. They cleaned their streets, built hospitals, appointed officials called plague wardens. Public health was born out of panic. It always is. The first isolation houses appeared, grim wooden huts on the edge of town. If someone was sick, you locked them inside and left food at the door. It sounds cruel, but compared to letting the whole neighborhood die, it was progress. By the late Middle Ages, people started connecting cleanliness with survival again. Bathhouses reopened, even civic hygiene became fashionable. Perfume evolved from necessity to luxury. Musk, civet, rosewater. Bath attendants became minor celebrities, and physicians began to suspect quietly, carefully, that perhaps disease came from tiny living things, not bad air or divine wrath. They were centuries early, of course, but it's nice to think someone was paying attention. Still, superstition lingered. When illness struck, people carried charms, wore gemstones, or tied onions to their belts. It rarely worked, but it made the world feel less random. And really, that's what most medieval medicine was. An act of faith disguised as treatment. Faith in God. Faith in herbs. Faith in the idea that something, anything, might keep you alive. Let's drift briefly into a quieter image, a small village at dusk. Smoke curling from the chimneys, the faint toll of a church bell for evening prayer. Inside, a family gathers. The air smells of thyme and wood smoke. The mother pours a little ale for courage, mutters a charm under her breath. Someone coughs. Someone sighs. And life goes on. Because it had to. The medieval world lived with death, the way we live with weather. Unpredictable, inevitable, sometimes cruel, sometimes kind. They mourned, yes, but they also accepted. They saw life as a loan, not a right, and in that strange, harsh wisdom, there was peace. Perfume faded, plagues passed, and time moved on. The air grew cleaner, the doctors smarter, the prayers shorter. But if you close your eyes tonight and imagine the faint scent of herbs in the dark rosemary, sage, lavender, you're breathing a memory of their world, a time when people feared the air itself and found beauty anyway. Hey everyone, tonight we're visiting the doctors, or rather, the people who claim to be doctors. Some of them very sincerely, some of them very creatively, because medicine in the Middle Ages was part science, part ritual, and part very confident guessing. Still, amid the leeches and the prayers, something remarkable was taking shape. A fragile understanding of care, of healing, of the simple idea that a sick person should be tended to instead of feared. So, take a breath. We're going to wander the candlelit corridors of early hospitals, the echo of cloisters, the smell of rosemary and blood. Don't worry. We'll keep the tone gentle. We might start with a confession. Most medieval doctors weren't what you'd call hands-on. They preferred to observe from a polite distance, ideally while wearing velvet robes and quoting Aristotle. The truly messy work, the bleeding, bandaging, and burying, was left to the barber surgeons. Yes, barbers, because if someone could shave a beard, surely they could remove a tumor. The logic was simple. Both jobs involved sharp metal and a steady hand. The results, however, varied. Medicine was a hierarchy. At the top were the physicians-educated men who studied in universities like Salerno, Bologna, and Paris. They spoke Latin, wore long gowns, and rarely touched patients. Their power lay in words and diagnosis, reading urine samples like crystal balls, checking pulses, and issuing long scrolls of dietary advice. If you were rich enough to afford one, your illness came with vocabulary. If you were poor, you got vinegar and prayer. Below them were surgeons who dealt with the practical horrors, wounds, fractures, boils, amputations they learned by doing often on battlefields or at the back of taverns. They weren't considered learned men, but they were indispensable, because when an arrow needed removing, philosophy had limited use. Many surgeons doubled as barbers, hence the red and white pole, symbol of blood and bandages, spinning cheerfully outside a shop where you could get both a shave and an operation. And at the very bottom, apothecaries, part chemist, part merchant, who sold herbs, ointments, and powders of varying effectiveness. Some genuinely helped. Some simply smelled impressive. It's easy to laugh now, but they were doing the best they could with what they had. Their entire worldview came from ancient Greece, from Hippocrates and Galen. They believed the human body was ruled by the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health meant balance. Sickness meant one humor had gone rogue. The cure: restore harmony. So, if you were feverish, they'd cool you. If you were pale and weak, they'd warm you, perhaps by setting leeches on your arm to draw out excess blood. It sounds absurd now, but in a strange way, it was a theory of equilibrium. The idea that your body was a small universe, trying to stay in tune with the larger one. Leeches, incidentally, were beloved. They were kept in jars of water and fetched out for delicate jobs, a sort of organic syringe. Some physicians swore by them for everything from headaches to gout. Others preferred more direct bleeding, slicing open a vein with a small knife called a lancet and collecting the result in a bowl. There was technique to it. Don't take too much, don't faint, and for heaven's sake, don't get blood on the patient's favorite tunic. Hospitals, for their part, kept careful accounts of leech inventory. They were expensive. After all, nature's tiny vampires for hire. Let's drift for a moment into a medieval hospital, because it's not what you might expect. Forget white walls and nurses in uniform. These were spiritual sanctuaries, part church, part hospice, part social safety net. The very word hospital came from hospasgest. The sick were seen as guests of God, to be fed, cleaned, and prayed over. Run by monks or nuns, the rooms were long and narrow, with rows of wooden beds. At the far end, an altar, so even the bedridden could see Mass. Medicine was care, not cure. If you survived, it was God's will. If you didn't, you at least died. Monastic infirmaries were surprisingly advanced for their time. Monks grew medicinal herbs, distilled tinctures, and even performed minor surgery. They kept records, neat Latin notes describing symptoms and treatments. They practiced hygiene, to washing hands before meals, boiling bandages, and isolating the sick. It wasn't germ theory, but it was discipline. And discipline, in a world of superstition, was halfway to science. The herbs themselves formed the heartbeat of medieval medicine. From monastery gardens to village healers' baskets, every plant had purpose. Willow barked for pain, garlic for infection, mint for digestion, rosemary for memory, and possibly for warding off evil spirits, depending on who you asked. There was charm in the mix, half pharmacology, half folklore. If the medicine worked, it was proof of divine grace. If it didn't, well, perhaps you'd offended St. Roch. Women played a larger role in healing than history usually admits. Midwives, wise women, herbalists. They were the first responders of their age. They treated wounds, delivered babies, and kept entire communities alive on instinct and inherited knowledge. But as universities rose and medicine professionalized, women were pushed aside. Healing became a man's business, and the women who continued were sometimes rebranded as witches. It's a familiar story. Power changes hands, but wisdom lingers in the shadows. Speaking of wisdom, not all medical texts were grim. Some were downright whimsical. One English manuscript suggested that a good cure for insomnia was to drink lettuce juice. Another recommended wearing a sapphire to stop nosebleeds. And for melancholy, a pleasant walk, music, and light conversation. Honestly, that last one still holds up. Laughter had a place, too. Medieval physicians believed joy improved the humors. Hospitals hired jesters to cheer the patients. Songs were sung, stories told, not because they expected miracles, but because they understood, in their quiet, medieval way, that the spirit mattered. They didn't know about endorphins, but they knew about hope. The universities of medicine grew steadily more sophisticated. In Salerno, students memorized the regimen Senatus Salernitonum, a rhyming manual of health. It offered gems like, "If thou wilt be healthy, rise early from bed, and after thy labor, see lightly thou fed." In other words, wake up, work hard, and eat moderately. Some advice really does survive the centuries intact. They also studied anatomy, though this was tricky, as human dissection was often frowned upon. Most learning came from pigs or, occasionally, condemned criminals. Textbooks were copied by hand, and when in doubt, physicians turned to astrology, because the position of Mars, naturally, affected your liver. If all else failed, there were pilgrimages. The sick would travel to holy shrines, seeking relics, bones, cloth, or droplets of saints' blood believed to heal. Water from Canterbury, dust from Santiago, oil from St. Catherine's tomb. Medicine for the faithful. Some returned cured. Most returned tired. But the journey itself was therapy. A moving prayer wrapped in blisters and belief. Let's pause here. In the hush of a hospital at night, you can almost hear it. The soft scrape of sandals on stone, the murmur of Latin psalms, the rustle of linen sheets. Somewhere a patient coughs. A sister stirs the fire. A leech jar sits quietly by the window, waiting for morning. The air smells of wine and thyme and candle wax. There's no hum of machines, no electric glow, just breath, prayer, and the persistent will to heal. And it's oddly peaceful. The medieval hospital didn't die out. It evolved slowly, stubbornly, like everything else in the Middle Ages. As towns swelled, the old monastic wards began to fill with strangers, travelers, orphans, the poor, the wounded, the lost. And as plague swept through Europe, again and again the idea of care changed from a monastic duty to a civic one. City councils began to build their own hospitals, financed by merchants and guilds. Some were acts of charity, some were acts of guilt, convening atonement for questionable business practices. Either way, beds appeared, walls rose, and medicine took another tiny step forward. The Black Death was, ironically, an extraordinary teacher. It didn't make people cleaner, but it made them observe. Monks recorded symptoms meticulously. Doctors compared notes. Cities created rules about burial, isolation, and waste. No one understood germs, but everyone sensed that proximity was dangerous. Quarantian, from the Italian quaranta giorni, 40 days, was born out of Venetian pragmatism. Ships arriving from plague ports were told to wait offshore. It was a guess, but a sensible one. And it worked, often enough to survive as policy. Today, the word remains, carrying with it a faint echo of that fear and discipline. Meanwhile, in universities, medicine was becoming a more structured affair. Students studied anatomy, physiology, and the art of polite disagreement with one another's interpretations of Galen. Lectures were read aloud while a lowly assistant, sometimes called the demonstrator, dissected a pig or a criminal below. The professor didn't lower his hands from his robe. He simply gestured with a pointer. The students copied everything into neat Latin, complete with decorative initials. One imagines it was a lot of whispering. It was not yet science, but it was repetition. And repetition, eventually, becomes method. A favorite text of the era was the Trotula, a collection of writings on women's medicine, compiled in It offered guidance on fertility, childbirth, and cosmetics, including recipes for removing freckles and sweetening the breath. Medieval priorities were, as ever, pragmatic in vain and equal measure. The author, or rather authors, were long believed to include a woman named Trotula of Salerno. Possibly real, possibly a convenient fiction for marketing to female patients. Either way, the book was widely copied, proving that medieval medicine could be, at moments, surprisingly inclusive. In Thucydides, surgeons were sharpening their knives. Wars, unfortunately, made for excellent teachers. The 100 Years' War, for all its carnage, created a generation of field medics who'd learned to set bones, cauterize wounds, and perhaps most importantly, stop bleeding without divine intervention. Cautery was the preferred method, a red-hot iron applied to the wound to seal it. Effective, excruciating, and unmistakably medieval. Anesthetics were minimal. Wine, opium, mandrake, or, when available, the comforting distraction of screaming. And yet survival rates improved, because even crude technique is better than none. Back in calmer quarters, apothecaries continued to blend the world's knowledge in little wooden shops. They measured out ground herbs, spices, and minerals, each stored in its own jar, labeled in fine Gothic script. A customer could buy Theriac, an all-purpose antidote, containing as many as 60 ingredients, including opium, cinnamon, and sometimes bits of viper. It was expensive, exotic, and utterly revered. Even kings kept a jar. When plague came, they burned juniper to cleanse the air. When winter lingered, they brewed tonics with honey and vinegar. Their understanding of chemistry was primitive, but their sense of experiment was bold. Somewhere between superstition and pharmacy, modern chemistry was quietly being born. The Church's role in all this remained paradoxical. It discouraged autopsy, but encouraged charity. It banned certain surgeries, yet blessed hospitals. The human body was sacred, but also a vessel of sin, tricky material for scientific curiosity. So medieval doctors learned to work within boundaries, wrapping their investigations in piety. They prefaced anatomy lectures with prayers. They justified dissection as a lesson in divine design. It was an elegant compromise. Curiosity disguised as devotion, and somehow, that compromise kept knowledge alive. The hospitals themselves began to specialize. Leprosy houses stood outside city walls, grim but organized. Foundling hospitals took in abandoned infants. Pest houses for plague victims were often staffed by volunteers, whose pay was mostly prayer. Inside, routines formed. Clean straw replaced soiled bedding. Herbs were hung from rafters to freshen the air. Meals were prescribed according to condition. Broth for the feverish, bread for the weak, a cautious sip of wine for everyone. It was not comfort by modern standards, but it was order. And order, in an age of chaos, was healing in itself. Occasionally, a particularly ambitious hospital built its own medical library. These were small rooms, but carefully tended, scrolls copied by candlelight, chained to the desks to prevent wandering scholars from wandering off with them. They contained recipes, astrological charts, translations from Arabic scholars like Avicenna and Al-Razi. From those pages flowed a quiet revolution, the reintroduction of classical learning to the West. The Arab world had preserved and expanded Greek medicine while Europe stumbled through its darker centuries. Now the manuscripts were returning, translated through Sicily and Spain, carrying with them algebra, anatomy, and a whiff of mint tea. Let's pause for a heartbeat and picture one of those manuscripts. A thick parchment page, letters brown from age, margins filled with tiny notes. Maybe there's a drawing of a leech, meticulously inked, or a little diagram of the human liver that looks more like a squash. It's imperfect, but it's progress. Every pen stroke is a small rebellion against ignorance. Every diagram, a whisper that says, we can understand this, if we're careful. And so they kept drawing, they kept writing, and eventually, the drawings got better. By the late 15th century, Europe was ready for a shift. The Renaissance was polishing its mirrors, rediscovering proportion, and preparing to look the human body squarely in the face. But even before Vesalius drew his famous anatomical plates, there were artists and doctors sketching limbs, organs, and skeletons, quietly, reverently. Leonardo da Vinci filled notebooks with exquisite dissections, blending art and anatomy until the two were inseparable. His sketches of muscles and tendons are still beautiful today. Part science, part meditation. He wrote in mirror script, perhaps to keep curious eyes from peeking, or perhaps just to remind himself that knowledge, like art, often looks backward before it moves forward. Meanwhile, common folk carried on with their own brand of medicine, folk charms. Herbal Salbis whispered blessings, a penny for the wise woman, a prayer for St. Blaise, a sprig of rue in the shoe to ward off fever. These weren't rival traditions, so much as parallel ones. For most people, the physician was far away, the surgeon expensive, the apothecary busy, so the village healer remained indispensable. Sometimes she was right, sometimes she wasn't. But she was present, and that counted for much. By now, the idea of the body as a system had taken firm root. No one yet knew about circulation or bacteria, but they knew the body was a network of cause and effect. And that, quietly, is where science begins. Not in certainty, but in noticing patterns. A fever breaks after bleeding. A wound heals faster if washed. Too much wine worsens gout, though few seemed willing to test that conclusion thoroughly. Observation replaced mere repetition, and from observation, understanding began to sprout. Somewhere in a quiet infirmary, a monk writes in his ledger, the patient was bathed in given broth. He slept peacefully. Deo gracias. No grand discovery. No revolution. Just care. And from such small notes, medicine advanced. By the 15th century, something peculiar began to happen to medicine. It started thinking, not just quoting or reciting, but truly asking questions. Why did some people survive a fever while others died? Why did one treatment help in one place, but fail in another? The old humors still ruled the theory, but the edges were starting to fray. It wasn't rebellion yet, more like the soft rustle before a storm. Scholars at places like Padua, Montpellier, and Bologna began performing regular dissections, not as heresy, but as education. They took careful notes. They noticed patterns, and very quietly, the body began to tell its secrets. Of course, the world outside those lecture halls remained as unwell as ever. Wars, famines, and plagues provided no shortage of case studies. The plague, in particular, left its signature on the medical mind. Every generation met its own wave. The Black Death in the 1340s, the Great Plague of the 1360s, the lesser outbreaks that followed like aftershocks. Each time, humanity reacted with the same grim rhythm. Fear, flight, prayer, and eventually, procedure. Cities posted watchmen at their gates. Ships waited there 40 days. Bodies were buried in fields outside town walls. Doctors, wrapped in their peculiar plague costumes, became a symbol of both dread and duty. The outfit, you've seen it. Long waxed coat, wide-brimmed hat, glass-eyed mask with a great curved beak. It looked absurd, but it made sense, in its own macabre way. The beak was filled with herbs, lavender, mint, cloves meant to purify the air, or at least make death smell slightly less offensive. The robe was coated in wax to repel miasmas, the foul vapors thought to carry disease. The stick, used to prod patients from a safe distance, doubled as a way to keep order if crowds became desperate. There was no germ theory, but there was instinct, the first fumbling recognition that disease was contagious, that it spread by contact in air. In a sense, the plague doctor was Europe's first hazmat suit. Terrifying, yes, but rational within its limits. Those doctors kept records. They wrote about what they saw: blackened limbs, swollen glands, the quiet fall of entire neighborhoods. And while they could not cure it, they watched it. They described it, and that act of watching, even through horror, was the beginning of epidemiology. It's tempting to pity them, but imagine the courage required. Walking from house to house, day after day, in a city where bells tolled endlessly, even knowing you could do nothing except try. That grim steadiness is its own kind of medicine. And afterward, when the plague withdrew, those same physicians applied what they had learned. Cities began to clean their streets more regularly. Markets regulated meat. Wells were protected. Slow, awkward hygiene, but hygiene nonetheless. Meanwhile, a quieter revolution was happening in monasteries and printing shops. The printing press, that wonderful piece of movable magic, changed medicine forever. Before printing, a medical book took months to copy. Now, knowledge multiplied. Anatomical diagrams, herbal guides, and practical manuals spread faster than ever before. One of the most popular early works was the Fasciculus Medis, published in 1491, a compilation of diagrams showing the human body, urine charts, and even instructions for treating wounds. Crude but clear, accessible. For the first time, medicine belonged not just to the university, but to the curious. The world was, quite literally, opening its pages.
Let's linger a moment on the urine wheel, one of the Middle Ages' more eccentric obsessions. Physicians believed a patient's urine could reveal nearly everything: personality, illness, even morality if you stared long enough. The wheel displayed a dazzling spectrum from pale straw to deep crimson, each shade corresponding to a diagnosis. Students memorized it. Patients provided samples in glass flasks held up to the light like fine wine tastings. It seems quaint, even absurd, but urine analysis remained a staple of medicine well into the modern age. The instinct to observe the body's waste for clues is, after all, quite scientific. The medieval mind simply took it with more poetry. Back in the wards, hospitals were slowly transforming into places of true treatment. Beds gained curtains, Patients were sorted by illness. In some cities, trained surgeons were put on staff permanently. Cleanliness, or at least the idea of it, began to matter. Hospitals in Florence, Paris, and London started building dedicated washing rooms. Some even had running water from nearby aqueducts. It wasn't modern plumbing, but it was a small miracle of engineering and mercy. Still, medicine remained a strange blend of hope and hazard. For every cautious innovator, there was a cheerful charlatan selling miracle powders in the market square. For every wise healer, a priest offering an exorcism, and the patient's poor souls shuffled between the two, hoping someone, anyone, might make them feel a little less miserable. One chronicler summed it up dryly: "Of all things uncertain, none is more uncertain than the art of healing." A fine understatement, considering he lived through the plague, but the spirit of medicine, by now, was unmistakable. It had shifted from divine mystery to human craft. Healing was no longer a miracle. It was a process, slow, fallible, but learned. Physicians began comparing case notes. Surgeons experimented with new stitches, cleaner instruments, and cauterization with boiled oil instead of red-hot iron. Progress, if not comfort. Hospitals opened windows for ventilation, rediscovered that light and air mattered. Someone even noticed that washing one's hands before tending wounds was wise. The connection wouldn't become formal until centuries later, but the instinct was already whispering. And beneath all this, there's something almost tender, a medieval sense of care that survives beyond the science. The soft voice of the nurse reading prayers, the apothecary labeling his jars by candlelight, the monk writing slept peacefully beside a patient's name. They didn't always heal bodies, but they guarded dignity. And perhaps that's the most medieval kind of medicine of all, the art of attending. By the time the 15th century gave way to the 16th, Europe was standing at the edge of a new world. The Renaissance, where anatomy would explode into art and surgery into science. Vicelius would soon open his cadavers and rewrite Galen entirely. Pear would abandon boiling oil and pioneer humane surgical methods. And hospitals would grow from shelters for the dying into laboratories of life. But for tonight, we can leave them here. The monks, the midwives, the surgeons, and the plague doctors, all part of a slow, strange story that began with herbs and ended with hospitals. The candles are nearly burned down now. The leeches, mercifully, are asleep in their jars. And somewhere a patient exhales softly, dreaming, perhaps, of a world where illness is no longer divine punishment, but simply something that happens and can be helped. So let's close the curtain on this part of our wander through medieval life. Medicine, in its fumbling, bloody, well-intentioned way, laid the foundation for everything to come. One quiet prayer, one cautious incision, one jar of mint-scented optimism at a time. The world outside is dark, but clean enough and very, very quiet. Good night, traveler.
Hey everyone. Tonight, we're not in a castle or a hospital. We're stepping quietly into the streets. It's late, well past curfew, and the city is breathing in its sleep. You can almost hear it. The creak of shutters, the splash of water in the gutter, the low hum of someone snoring 3 houses away. Medieval towns never went entirely still. Even when the bells marked midnight, something was always moving in the dark. So, pull your blanket a little tighter. We'll wander the alleyways softly and see what the night looked like before streetlights, before silence was ever complete. By day, the medieval city was kiosk-shouting vendors, clattering carts, livestock attempting civic participation. But at night, it shrank into something small and cautious. Most people stayed indoors. Curfew bells rang to remind them that the night officially belonged to the watchmen, the drunks, and whatever else didn't mind the dark. The wealthy might keep a lamp burning by the door. Everyone else relied on moonlight and muscle memory. Lanterns were precious tiny beacons made of horn or oiled linen, carried by servants or shared between neighbors like gossip. If you tripped, you didn't curse the darkness. You blamed the devil, or perhaps the city council for poor paving. The night watch patrolled with halberds and low expectations. Their main job was to make sure no one was up to anything enjoyable. They shouted the hour and the weather, partly for reassurance, partly to stay awake. Past 2 o'clock, and all's well, they'd call. Itrarelli was, but it sounded nice. Thieves preferred roofs to streets, slipping across tiles like restless cats. Taverns still glowed after hours, their doors politely locked but never completely closed. And every so often, a monk passed by on his way to matins, murmuring prayers into the chill. It was a patchwork. Peace and easy, imperfect, but familiar. Of course, not everyone could afford to sleep indoors. The poor, the pilgrims, the travelers they found corners under arches, or beside becovens. They kept a little warmth. A dog might curl against a wall for comfort. Children might dream between barrels. Cities smelled of humanity, then bread, ash, sweat, and something quietly alive. And beneath the cobblestones, another city stirred. The rats. They didn't mind the hour. For them, night was breakfast. Rats were not yet villains in fairy tales. They were simply neighbors. Every granary had them. Every alley fed them. They were the quiet, industrious tenants of medieval life. No one guessed they were carrying plague again and again, tucked inside their fleas like tiny, furry time bombs. People just swept crumbs aside, muttered God's creatures, and went back to bed. If you listened hard enough, you might hear them little claws tapping beneath the floorboards, composing the night's soundtrack. The streets themselves were narrow veins of mud and refuse. Rain turned them into puddled mirrors where the stars looked tired. There were no drains, as we know them, just open channels that carried everything somewhere else, usually to another unfortunate street. Still, there was beauty. Moonlight on wet stones, the gentle glow of a single candle behind a shutter, a lull in the noise so deep you could almost believe the world was kind. In the homes of merchants and scribes, families slept huddled together, children on pallets, parents under heavy wool. Fires were banked low to save wood. Sometimes the smell of smoke mingled with dreams, so that people woke believing they'd glimpsed hell or heaven, depending on the draft. If someone needed the privy, they used a chamber pot and prayed their aim was true. The contents would be emptied into the street at dawn with a cheerful shout of warning. Garde-des-elle, a phrase that survives today as loo. Progress, like plumbing, takes its time. Out beyond the walls, the countryside was darker still. No torches, no bells, just the soft music of owls and wind. Travelers rarely risked it after sunset. Roads had thieves, and forests had stories. People spoke of will-o'-the-wisps, ghostly lights that lured wanderers into swamps. They were probably just methane, but no one was eager to test the theory. So they stayed put, tucked into whatever shelter they had, letting the dark wash over them like slow water. In cities, sleep itself was different. People often woke in the middle of the night, what we'd call first sleep and second sleep. Between them came an hour or two of quiet wakefulness, prayer, talk, or simply staring at the ceiling beams. Then, when the cock crowed, they drifted back for another short rest. The night wasn't one long stretch of unconsciousness. It was a rhythm, a conversation with darkness. Maybe that's why medieval life seemed slower, because even their sleep had pauses. Sometimes, a distant bell signaled fire. Everyone feared fire. Wood and thatch burned to us. Men formed bucket chains from wells while women carried out what mattered. Icons, bedding, and bread. Flames moved fast, but communities rebuilt faster. They always did. It was the quiet resilience of people used to uncertainty who knew that tomorrow would smell of smoke and life would continue anyway. Toward dawn, the city changed again. Bakers stirred. The first carts rattled in from the fields with milk and vegetables. Watchmen yawned their last announcement. It is 4 of the clock, and fair. Windows began to open. The sky went from ink to gray to a color that wasn't quite blue. The rats vanished. The monks finished matins, and the city, after its long uneven dream, exhaled. So ere wea. At the end of our wandering, we've drifted from baths to beds, from leeches to lanterns, and found that even in the dirtiest centuries, people kept trying to make life bearable. They built baths when they could, hospitals when they must, and faith when they had nothing else. They weren't clean by modern standards, or even comfortable, but they were human stubbornly, beautifully human. If you listen now, you might still hear them. The monk humming over his herbs, the surgeon sharpening his knife, the baker kneading dough in a house that smells faintly of smoke and rosemary. The Middle Ages never really sleep. They just dim the lights. So, close your eyes. Let the cobblestones fade beneath your feet. Let the rats find other business. The bells have rung their last. All's well. Sleep softly. The candles are out, and history at least for tonight is resting.